thing.
Right.
And hi, this is Paul. And Mick is a familiar face because of I met you at the
Hmm.
Fresno meetings, right?
Yep. A
So,
couple of
and
times.
you got one of the cherished rando slots. You're a
I
very
did.
lucky man. They're not
Uh,
easy to come by.
well, I had a thought before Christmas break because I'm a teacher. I need to look and see if there's a slot. I don't know what I would talk about, but I need to look and see. And then I looked and there was nothing. And I looked and there was nothing. And a couple of days ago, I looked. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Jumped on it. So anyway, but I wanted to say thank you to one of my favorite beings of light because you are one of those people who have been a sort of a guide and a virtual mentor for the last couple of years as I've gone through some things. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mick. Well, what would you like to do? I know you shared, you wrote out some of your story on the Calendly thing. Would you like to kind of go through your story, or how would you like to use the time today?
I guess so. It's one of those things. I have often thought, oh, I should have a conversation with Paul. What on earth would anybody want to know about some knuckle dragging, mouth breathing rando football coach from Fresno? Because you know, do have as I guess as a claim to fame, you probably haven't talked to any such people.
No, not on my channel, just in real life.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with your story then and just kind of see where it goes?
All
Because
right.
it's a good story.
Good. Right. I do have a couple of questions we'll get to at the end, hopefully, if there's time.
Okay.
But, so story, and I've watched enough of these to know kind of how they go.
Yep.
I was born a poor black child. No, just kidding. I grew up in Pentecostal church, Assemblies of God, which is, I guess in some ways, at least from my experience, is Pentecostal light rather than full on. And that's just kind of the nature of the congregations that my family was part of, being in Central California, as opposed to other more difficult or conservative parts of the world, you might say. We had the glossolalia. There would be occasional, probably once, twice a month, somebody speaking in tongues during the Sunday service, and then an interpretation. Whether or not that was done correctly is open to question, I guess. But we didn't have the full-on holy roller experience with the actual holy rolling or snake handling and some of those kinds of stereotypical things. That was not us. But we were the two congregations that I were in were pretty just what you would call Pentecostal, evangelical, but not in any extreme. And I credit. I'm not the person to give credit to anybody specifically, but the pastors that led these congregations were absolutely godly men who were learned and understood as much of history and theology as anybody in our congregation does, because that's kind of a rare thing in that particular congregation and Pentecostalism generally, as you have pointed out over the past several years. Anyway, all of that to say, grew up very, very Christian, very conservative. The extent of my high school rebellion was me telling my parents before 9th grade, I am not going to go to that public school down the road. I refuse. Not going to happen. There are bad people there and I don't want to be around them. So they had, okay, what do we do? There was a relatively new Christian, multi-denominational Christian high school here in town. And so let's try that. And that is one of those most important events of my life.
Wow.
To be able to be put into that kind of a situation.
Yeah.
I had always been kind of an anxious kid, a little, socially unsure. I can remember several times my parents trying to put me into social situations, large groups of people, and just having kind of the internal panic attack, but not full on meltdown, shutdown thing. That kind of came later as other things in life happened. But so I always had kind of that thing going on with me. And so smaller situations, smaller settings, more sensitive people, I guess, has just been a safe place for me for all of my life. And I credit that Christian school with a lot of my formation and my experience, and to such a degree that I went away to a public university, big, major, it was UC Santa Barbara, which back in the 1980s and early 90s was actually ranked as the #1 party school in the world. And I had zero.
It's right on the beach.
Oh, yeah. And my dorm room, my freshman year, I could see there was a sand volleyball pit, which was a cause of temptation and mental sin, and the beach off in the distance. I could see the ocean from my bedroom. And so that was, awesome in some ways, challenging in other ways, as you might expect. But I had an experience there where I found a community of believing, faithful people who were able to encourage me in faith and encourage me in as much of a godly living situation as can be had in that kind of a physical environment. But I had a lot of the sheltering kinds of things that the atheists and the rationalists will say. You're just sheltered. You're not actually experiencing what reality is, and that's okay. That's what I needed. So, did college, moved back, did the rebound thing, because after college, what do you do? What does an English major do, in particular? I started off as microbiology because I like science, but I cannot do math beyond knowing what the Pythagorean theorem is. And that's really the only thing in math that I needed other than a basic addition subtraction is the Pythagorean theorem, because that's how I set up a football field. I know what 3, 4, 5 is, and I know where the corners are, and I can make it work. So what does an English major do? I started working at the local junior college, just in the computer writing lab. And I had been praying for a couple of 3, 4 months as I'd gotten back into the churches, my parents' church's college career group, and great people, loving people, and encouraging. Started praying, God, I need a life partner now, because college is done. Yep. So he provided. I had a very specific list of about 10 things and got 9 out of the 10. It was awesome. And so, yeah, I'm engaged now. I need a job. So, okay, I know English literature fairly well. So what do? Let's find a teaching position. So I sent letters to every single private Christian school in Central California, all the way up through Oregon and Washington. Family friends in Oregon ran a school. He was a superintendent. We'd known them when I was a little kid. My family had lived there. And so he said, oh, okay, let's give you a shot. So I moved away, did that, started the school year. My fiance finished up at Cal in 3.5 years, which is impressive because she is just scary smart. And didn't, so we got married in January, and in fact, tomorrow is my 26th anniversary.
Wow, congratulations.
Kind of yeah, and so that's a good thing. And so I came back down to Fresno. We got married on January 7th, 1995, and the honeymoon was actually spent in separate cars driving from Fresno to Albany, Oregon during the storm of the century, where you probably weren't in Sacramento at that time yet. So all of South Sacramento flooded, the levees broke, the whole thing. And we stayed in Sacramento overnight at the Riverboat Hotel. Was it like the River King or Delta King or something like that? And I woke up in the morning and there were giant sycamore trees floating down the middle of the river. So we drove in separate cars. It's not an optimal honeymoon, but it worked. And we got to Oregon. I taught for a couple of years there. My wife, who, like I said, again, is really smart, there was a lot of kind of pressure on her to do great things, to be president and that sort of stuff. And so she decided, I need to go to law school. So, okay, let's go. She got into McGeorge in Sacramento. We moved to Sacramento. It took her about 4 months, just a week shy of one semester, to realize attorneys are bad and I don't want to be one. And the only way I can pay off these loans that I'm accumulating is to be the worst possible attorney. So we punched out of that, and her mom was gracious enough to go ahead and over the course of a couple of years pay off those loans for us. So that's a huge blessing. And just because of an aside, my wife grew up as an Episcopalian. So me, Assemblies of God, her Episcopalian. How do we go to church together? Let's find a Presbyterian church. And so that worked for a little while. Then we moved back to California and started looking around. And so we started a journey. We're kind of working through the various major denominations. We were Mennonites for a fair bit of time. A great Mennonite Brethren church just about 2 miles from your church, actually, Greenhaven Neighborhood Church.
Oh yeah, I know people there.
Yeah, Greenhaven and Arc Way.
Yeah.
And so since she stopped going to law school, she had to do something, and she was an English major too. So what does an English major do? Become a teacher.
Yeah.
So she got a job with Sac City Unified, and she taught at another place you probably will recognize, John Bidwell Elementary.
Absolutely. That's right over here.
Half a mile from where you are. We live just south of the airport there. So we were
right where I live.
All in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were on 50th Avenue.
Oh, okay. That's just right down the road here.
Exactly. Yeah, 50th and 24th were our cross streets. Anyway, so we did that for a long time. I got a job in Vacaville, teaching at Vacaville Christian High School, and loved that. And we were involved in the church there at Greenhaven. Pastor said, you're doing pretty good at this. Why don't you come on as, the elder board, for about 30-year-old guy? Not a good idea. All the reasons that Paul cautions people to not do these things young. Yeah, not do these things young. Yeah. And it played into that a little bit, but it was okay. I survived, and the church survived. And I said, maybe I ought to try seminary and look at pastoral ministry. So I did that and started at Western Seminary's extension there in Sacramento. Yeah. And went to a couple of classes over in Los Gatos. And my first semester, I think it was my first semester, maybe it was the second, the personal ministry evaluation class, where you do all the personality profiles, and at the end of all of that, having done the Myers-Briggs and about the DISC and 2 or 3 other of those profiles, got to the end of the semester, had my evaluation with the professor, and he had looked at everything and said, "You should not be a pastor."
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Your personality is such that this is not a good idea for you. And I said, okay, well, I guess, okay. That means I get to skip out on Hebrew and Greek, which I was not looking forward to anyway. Being a knuckle-dragging mouth breather, those are kind of scary things. So went back to teaching. So teaching, try pastoral ministry. They say, don't be a pastor. Obviously, it's okay to be a teacher. That doesn't
hurt anybody. It's just
doesn't
kids.
hurt anybody. Yes, exactly. They'll recover, right? And I had that's just a natural fit. Teenagers for me, at least, I will concede this, in a Christian school environment, teenagers are not scary beasts. They are kind of magical and kooky, but they're not scary. Yeah. I did some time as a presenter in the public schools in Sacramento, domestic violence and crisis counseling kinds of things, and a little more scary in that environment, but for what it's worth. So did that, and a couple of years later, you're back into teaching, and it's time to start a family. And try as we might, it would not work in the normal way, as it does for most people. Yeah. And we said, we are not interested in padding some fertility doctor's wallet. Yeah. So let's find other options. So the foster adopt system, there are thousands of children who need jobs. And over time, I have come to realize that I had a lot of arrogance about, how wonderful that is and how wonderful I, am for trying to be a foster adoptive parent. And that was foolish. I'll just put it that way. That was absolutely foolish. So we did that. We had some ups and downs, some challenges, and some trials. But then it was in 2001, just before Christmas, get a call from our social worker, said, "Can you come down to the office? We'd like you to meet some social workers and talk about some things." And so we did that. I took the day off of work. It was 2 days before the Christmas break anyway. And Chris took the day off of work, and we went and met these social workers, talked to them for a little while. They went out of the room, and they came back with a baby. Yeah, it's one of those kinds of situations. It said, "This is so-and-so, and he's 4 months old, and
Wow.
What do you think?" And so we looked at each other and, okay, yes, let's do this. And that was beautiful and wonderful, and becoming a father in that way, although be a little bit unusual, was amazing and a blessing from God. And as part of the process, you get to unofficially rename, some kids if they're young enough, and he was 4 months old, and so his middle name is Emmanuel, God with us, because that's what it felt like. And I'm going to try to not get choked up about that.
Yeah.
So being a new parent is challenging and awesome, and we had to figure out how to do all that stuff, because we had most things taken care of, but then it happened. And there really isn't the 9 months of ramping up as you might normally experience. So all of that to say, good, trials, challenging. And then the week before Easter, that following year, 2002 Easter, our social worker shows up at our house and says that our son's case is being joined to an older sibling. He has a number of older siblings that were all in the system, and his older sibling was being moved from foster care to a biological relative. Their cases were now joined. We had no recourse, and he was gone within a couple of days. And so that's when things started to get more intense. So that was not a good Easter for us. My parents blessed us with a week away. Chris and I we flew to DC, kind of toured around Virginia, which will come into play later. It had just some retreat time, came back, finished the school year, and was just kind of numb. And it felt like a kidnapping because, my little boy is out there in the world somewhere. Somebody's got him. Who knows what they're doing to him? And it was just horrendous. And God, what do you have against firstborns?
Yeah.
Why do you make these promises and then yank them away?
Yeah.
And so I, read the story of Abraham a few times, hoping that would be helpful, but it is only marginally helpful when you're in the middle of things.
Yeah.
And just kind of angry and numb. So I don't know if that's compatible, but that's what it felt like.
Yeah.
Numb to happiness, but anger just kind of kept burbling up and burbling up and burbling up.
Yeah.
So we get into the summer, and we get a call from a different social worker that we had some connection with. Said, "Can you come meet me at the hospital?" And so we did that. And there was a young woman in there, it was a crisis pregnancy agency, and she had just had a baby and was not going to be taking the baby home. So again, you go from nothing to, she liked us well enough to give her baby up to us. And the next day we took her home, and that was July 16th of 2002. And we had this two-day-old baby girl.
Wow.
And part of my heart is just still dead. So I had a hard time with that. My wife, God bless her, was equally broken, but she is smarter than me, more compassionate than me, better in every way, except I can pick things up and she can't. So she was able to immediately become the mom that this little girl needed, and she needed a lot. So because she didn't sleep, and she still doesn't. Those challenging things. When you are born in a physical and chemical environment like that, it's a challenge. So I'll leave that at that. But my anger had not gone away.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of going through life and getting up in the morning and doing what has to be done.
Yeah.
And we, middle of August of that year, so this is a month later after my daughter had come home with us from the hospital, I get a call from another social worker. And she said, so I saw this letter that you had written for this little boy in his file, and he's being separated from where he was. Are you interested in having him back? Yeah. And so just seeing your face, that's just kind of all of the relief. Yes, God, this is how you do things.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense,
but
you do this and you bless.
Yeah.
And that was, so he came home to us 2 days before his first birthday. And in some ways, he was kind of emotionally and physically sort of stunted.
Yeah.
Like he hadn't been gone, like nothing positive had happened during that time.
Yeah.
But God blessed us and brought him back. And that's one of those things in my life that I can say, yes, God does these things and God works.
Yes.
Because that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You can talk to social workers everywhere, and it's just a very rare thing that they will go back to people that have been tossed aside in that way. So that was beautiful and wonderful and lovely. And you would think for rational creatures would be able to see that and say, okay, things are better now. All of that pain and trauma can go away. You would think.
Yeah.
But
That's not how people work.
It really, really isn't. And so the damage was done. Yeah. We had pulled out of where we had been going to church, just kind of separated, isolated. My anxiety ramped up. Yeah. Did all of those things. And so we moved away from Sacramento, moved back to Fresno to be near family and all of that kind of thing. And God continued to bless us. Yeah. And do all of the things that God does for his people. Yeah. But like I said, the damage was done. The tree inside was rotten and needed to be dealt with. Yeah. But it took a long, long time. I got a job actually teaching at my alma mater. So the office that I'm sitting in is my PE office at the place where I went to high school, which is awesome and a blessing in itself. Yeah. So I am now who my teachers were then. Yes. That helped to form me. Yep. And again, that's God doing what he does. Yep. Yep. But just the things were not okay. Yeah. The anxiety level, it just kept building and building. And as the kids got older and their challenges continued to manifest, we knew from the first day that my daughter, there were going to be issues there. Yeah. And as she got older and went through being 4, 5, 6, 7, good times, bad times,
Yeah.
but we knew when we hit puberty, it was going to be dumping a whole gallon of gas on the fire.
Yep.
And
Yep.
maybe,
Yep.
maybe I made that happen by thinking about it. I don't know, but it just,
it's not an unreasonable prediction given the systems and the situations you're dealing with. I mean, anybody who's been around any of that knows.
Yeah. And so we expected it, and it came to pass, and we have been blessed that it's not been like some of our friends who have had even much more difficult and heartbreaking situations. So, but it sucks when I know this is going to go public because I want it to, so I have to be careful for her sake. But hard. Hard in many ways. And
even all my 5 kids are from me and my wife, and my kids are astoundingly wonderful, better than I deserve, but there are always moments. It's just it's the way it is.
Right. It is what it is. And my son has his difficulties, but he's wired different, and different biology, different circumstances, different temperaments, and different callings on us produce different things. So I'll get back to his story in a second. So that stuff just continued to add poison to that rotten-hearted tree. And up to this point, this was in 5-6 years ago, and so the children are now 18 and 19. They're only 11 months apart by in age. So it's they're Irish twins, even though one is Mexican and the other is multi-ethnic. So yeah, the one funny thing, before we moved back to Fresno, it was the day before we moved. I had my daughter at the grocery store just down there it's not very far from your church. And I was at the checkout line holding her, and an African-American lady from the neighborhood saw us and smiled, and I smiled back. And she said, "Your daughter is lovely. She has your eyebrows." So I just had to smile and say, "Thank you." But it's difficult. Anyway, all of that to say, life got a lot harder at home, which eventually affected work, which kind of changed. I had my job duties changed such that I wasn't coaching for a while, but still teaching and doing what I need to do there. But that was when God started to prompt me, and I was beginning to do a deconstruction. And I think I wrote in my note to you that, like I said, and you have said before, that the sunk cost, that is a great analogy or metaphor, whatever the term is for that. I love that, because that's what I had. My entire life was sunk into a life of faith, and the faith was not sufficient for me, or at least I thought so at that moment. So I started to deconstruct and said, no, I can't deconstruct. This is not okay. So the way I view it is renovation. The foundation is still there. The outside walls are still there. I look more or less like I did 5, 10, 15 years ago on the outside, but the inside is all new. My wife and I, over our course of our marriage, have totally renovated 4 different houses. And so I was familiar with that. So the metaphor works for me.
It's a good metaphor. I'm gonna steal it.
Okay, yeah.
I'm gonna steal it.
Renovation is a hard process. And sometimes you gotta snort up the dust and the dirt that you get from tearing things down. But I think what is coming out of it, it's certainly not done, but it's starting to take a better shape. So you played a role in that. I didn't want to go to church ever, from about, I don't know, from the time we moved back to Fresno, we had a hard time plugging into church, just anywhere. I couldn't connect. I would got to the point where I would wait until just before it's time to start, or get there so early that I got a seat and then kind of isolated myself physically, head down, all that kind of just physical isolation. So I didn't have to talk to people. And as soon as the last song was done, bolt, because I just can't talk to these people. I can't do small talk. All of this is ridiculous, but I know that I need to be in church because that's
who you are. That's
who I am.
Your world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and being at a Christian school and having chapel 2 times a week on a regular basis and experiencing, okay, this is not worship. This is teaching children how to go to concerts. And it just disgusted me. And I'm still there, but I found a way now to cope with that. For a couple of years, I could not even go into the chapel services. I just would find anything else I could do. No, that's gotten better now. But so I was listening to a podcast about weightlifting, and one of the guys did a book mention. He said, "Oh, everybody ought to read this book, 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson." Okay. I trust this guy, so I'll take a look at this book. I bought the book, read it, found the YouTube channel, devoured the biblical series stuff. The algorithm led me to you, which is beautiful and wonderful. And then Pajot led me to a whole host of Orthodox input. So Father Stephen Freeman, and then the Areopagites, Father Andrew Damick, and Father Stephen DeYoung, and a whole bunch of other guys who had a different experience. And being Pentecostal, not that I had been Pentecostal for a long time, I had just kind of rejected all of that, but the core was still there back in the recesses.
Yeah.
And there are some points of connection.
Yeah.
In fact, I listened to a podcast yesterday. A gentleman named Father Barnabas Powell in Alabama was a former Pentecostal preacher and became an Orthodox priest. And so he's writing a book about those connections. So the groundwork was laid.
Yep.
Now, so in that process, my son is having his own crises, and he decides he wants to be Catholic. Partly because he's contrary, and we homeschooled our kids. He had a class with a guy who said some, I guess, unflattering things about Catholicism and about Catholics, and my son took the contrary position because that's his nature, and it became something real for him. So he started a process of becoming Catholic.
Be careful what you try to colonize people with.
Exactly. And I had no frame of reference for that. I had always believed, unlike some, that Catholics are Christians and earlier Christians than us, but they're different. And they've got a whole bunch of stuff that's just kind of weird. So why would I want to be interested in that? But then this orthodoxy thing was starting to happen in my head, and my son, he wants to go to a Catholic university and become a classics professor of all things.
Wow.
And teach ancient mythology and all of that kind of stuff. He's loved that from when he was 3 years old, and we read him Beowulf and Grendel and all of the Greek myths. So my wife and I committed. She actually used the RC Catechism for his Bible class his senior year, and went through that whole thing. And we committed to taking him to Mass every Sunday for that year prior to going to college. He got into a college in Virginia. So the story comes back around. So he is he's a sophomore now at Christendom College in Virginia, and it's a conservative Catholic school, and he's trying to figure out where he wants to go to grad school. And it's, so that's a beautiful story of itself, which will take another hour, but we won't get there. But in that process, I said, yes, I will go with you to Mass, because I'm not going to those other places. I refuse. I won't go back to those. I won't use derogatory terms for it. Not the right thing to do, but and it was a while before I could start to appreciate that and what Mass was. And it's a Novus Ordo Mass. So we bounced around a couple of different places in town, settled on the cathedral in town, and I began to develop an appreciation for it. But I had this other Orthodox thing kind of still swirling in the back of my head and in my heart. And when we took him to school in Virginia and then came back, where are we going to go to church? I want to be Orthodox. And my wife said, well, we've done this Catholic thing for a year now. And if we do this, we lose potential for long-term communion with our son. What do we do? And so we attended the Serbian Orthodox Church in town, a couple of services there, and ethnicity is an issue. I'll just leave it at that.
It's gonna be.
As it was when we tried to be Mennonites.
Exactly. Because I know those people. And they're wonderful people, but they're German Mennonites. That's what they are.
Exactly. And my best friend from high school is a Mennonite, and he played the Mennonite game. And it's, who am I related to today? And so we knew that was going to be a problem. And then she'd been listening to podcasts, and there were these Byzantine priests who would do the reflections on the daily readings for the RC and for the Byzantine churches. And she said, what can we find that's like this? There is one in town. It's the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Apostolate of the Archangel Michael. And this here, I don't know if you can see it.
Oh,
this is
wow.
a Pajot. This is St. Michael stabbing the devil. And this is from Pajot's Teespring. Thank you, Jonathan Pajot, for all that you do. And so we tried that. And the first time we attended Divine Liturgy, all of the walls fell down. And this is the place. This is the group of people. This is the mode of worship that I'm supposed to be in. And I think most people have kind of the songs that get stuck in their head, and the little earworms and things that you wake up in the morning and you've got some stupid song in your head, whether it be the Beatles or Pearl Jam or whoever else. And so the song that's in my head now is the Divine Liturgy, as the Chrysostom liturgy in the Ukrainian tones is what I hear. So we did that, and we went from August through till January, and this is 1 year ago today. This is my anniversary of being chrismated and received into the UGCC.
Congratulations.
And God has blessed me, and I'm back coaching again, and people look at me differently. And I do have to say that some of the change was discovering that the anxiety goes away when I take a methylated multivitamin and 5-HTP and gamma aminobutyric acid, and levels everything out. We found that out. My daughter had that stuff prescribed to her for mood regulation, and it works on me too. And that's part of the internal renovation as well. Is
Yep.
all of that
Yep.
biochemistry gets sorted out.
Yep.
And I don't want to go around hitting everybody I see in the head with a stick.
Yeah.
Which is the way that I spent about 10 years.
Yeah.
Of life, and it's good to not want that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
now
wonderful.
Yes,
That is a wonderful story, and I'm so glad you told it. And I know stories that are similar to it, of course, having done what I've been doing for the last 3 years, and so I'm so glad that you told it. It's living water to my soul to hear it.
Yeah.
Which sounds weird for a Dutch Calvinist minister to say that, I know, but I can see the joy, and no, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's you are, like I said before, you're one of the people that were instrumental, and vicariously, of course, because we've had, two times being in each other's presence, and you don't know me from anybody.
Well, I remember little bits of your story. It's much easier for me to remember people when I see them live in person. Faces hit, and so I didn't remember the name, but when your face came up, I knew exactly who you were, and little bits of your story still remained in there. So.
And one of the things that you said at that first meeting at the Chico's there in Fresno was, in talking about love and loving family, and what you say time and again is even up to your enemies, especially when the enemies are in your family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's been transformational for me. And I think about that weekly, if not daily sometimes, when it is necessary to think about it daily. Yeah. So that's been a blessing. So you have blessed thousands of people, however many tens of thousands of subscribers are blessed by you, but the ones that you talk to are even more blessed. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
In the context of questions, I don't know if you wanted to say any more.
No, go for it.
Okay. Kind of in that vein, let's see, where is that question? Yeah. You have spoken in talking about parenting adult children.
Yeah.
And essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's mostly an exercise in suffering and frustration, or something along those lines.
Yeah. And your ability to endure suffering. It's so much of the Christian life is that. Can you carry your cross? Yeah.
And one of the things that I was having a really hard time with in trying to live in a, I'm not going to say Calvinist, because that's something different, but a Calvinish mode of being. I could not find any way of hope for the future in that regard. And so how does one in that milieu recapture or hold on to hope for kids or children that are straying or rebellious or actively rejecting?
Yeah.
It's just a hard thing.
Yeah.
I don't know how to.
For me, let me say, I mean, again, for some people, it would seem odd that I would celebrate your renovation from traditions, Protestant traditions, perhaps a bit closer to my own, into a liturgical sacramental tradition. But, the story justifies itself, and anyone who has had enough understanding of your background and your story, and you laid it out so well, I would have a hard time seeing people, really criticize the path that you took. It's so obviously been life-giving and important and transformational. And, people often deconstruct because they don't they don't know how to renovate. And you sounds like you've done that well. And so, but I, I each of the traditions manages, the Christianity is cruciform because of the brokenness of this world. The world crucified Jesus. Just this past week, I preached on John 1. The darkness did not, and that Greek word is a little hard to translate. The darkness did not overcome him. The darkness did not understand him. The darkness could not finally overwhelm him. In fact, and the message of the gospel is that he will overwhelm the darkness. Now, what does that do for each of us and our stories? It's a theodicy comes into this, because why would a loving God allow, and especially from, the story of your children, your children were completely blameless in the very difficult stack of cards they were dealt. And you and your wife were under absolutely no obligation to shoulder those crosses. And your children are not the crosses. That the crosses came with those children, and they came with those children in the biological formation of those children in the wombs of their mothers, in the there's a whole world that dealt those cards to those children that those children bear zero responsibility for. And you and your wife stepped into that situation and said, you knew those children were going to have to bear the crosses that were given to them by everything leading up to their conception and birth. And you and your wife stood next to those children and said, we will bear that cross with you. And what parents do is parents always bear the crosses of their children. And so we might ask, well, how on earth could a good and loving God justify a world in which all this sort of cross bearing takes place? And I cannot string together words that will somehow dispel this for everyone and in every way. But what I do know of cross bearing and suffering is that there is always the potential. And where there's potential, there is hope. And the Greek word for hope is in English, hope sort of means potential. In Greek, hope is both potential and promise, and a God-shaped promise that the cross-bearing will not be in vain. And we don't know how God squares this. That's not ours to know, but that's where faith steps in and says that the cross bearing that you and your wife and your children have had to do, the promise of God is that this cross bearing will not be in vain. Now, how that comes to pass, whether that comes to pass in this dispensation, there are these little lives we have between conception and death. How God sorts that out, we don't know. But we have his promise, and the promise looks like his son splayed on a cross of our own making. And that is what we cling to. And it is easy to despair. It is easy to it is not easy. It's not actually easy to despair. It is easy to despair in a moment. It is hard to live with despair. And so in my thinking, and part of my Calvinism, however twisted and misshapen it actually is, my Calvinism emphasizes the freedom, the sovereignty, and the power of God to use suffering to make stories that are so good and so powerful and so redemptive that somehow they couldn't be told without the suffering. Because if you had told me a story that, you know, these kids have a hard time, we took in foster kids and we adopted them and they raised them, and you know what, you know, everything went well. The kids were a jewel. They made great choices. They validated our choices by embracing our religion and many other, you know, our politics and many other things that we care about. And they're living today doing the same things that we did. That would be a beautiful story, and I would love to hear it. But the story you told is so much more powerful and so much better for those of us who live in this broken world, because you told a story of, you know, your story is hard to disregard because you have suffered for it. And part of the reason I think so many of us, you know, caught sight of Jordan Peterson and sort of found each other through this whole movement was, you know, there was a certain validity and authenticity to Jordan Peterson by virtue of his suffering, and even by virtue of his daughter's suffering. And, you know, your story is authentic because it is true. And your love for your children, it's easy to love a child that is easy to love.
That's
And
not loving. That's just enjoying something that's good.
that's exactly right. But you and your wife have shown that you know how to love, and love is the greatest thing there is. We know that. And you have demonstrated that, and you have lived that.
I will say that my wife has done that well. Of the handful of things that I have competency in, parenting is not on the list. But my wife has been the example of how to love sacrificially. She is a picture of agape. I am more a picture of whatever.
But you
Bad.
did not leave. And you and I both know that there are 1,000 ways to withhold, withdraw, evade, avoid, shirk. You know, how many words do we have for it? And sure, I'm sure you've done it in your own different ways all the way through, and lots of little things. I know I have. We all do. But you didn't leave. You stayed. You stayed in the marriage. You stayed as a parent. You stood when many others cut and run. And to me, that is faithfulness. And when people are faithful, we are all inspired to try to be faithful too. And that is no small thing. And even if you didn't do it perfectly, which none of us do, you stood. And that's really important. And that, you know, whatever happens in terms of our children, whether they validate or honor us in the end, part of the mercy of us dying before our children do, and that's why it's so hard when a child dies before a parent, is we leave, no matter in what state we leave, while there's life, there's potential and there's time and there's hope. And I, 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 I think we have to take Christ at his word that we do not labor in vain. And this is exactly what he's talking about. So I think that's how I see it. And we're out of time.
Exactly.
And I
was
need
just
a
going to
few
say,
minutes to get ready for the
Right.
next conversation. But
yeah, I was just going to say that thank you, because that's what I needed to hear. And we are out of time. And this has been such a blessing, Paul. And shout out to Luke Thompson. Just had to say that. He's cool. And Dr. O'Reilly is awesome as well. And thank you. I appreciate the time.
thank you, Mick. And I look forward to, I mean, once this COVID thing is done, I'm sure we'll do some more things with the Fresno meetup group.
Yes.
And thank you for
Yes.
that. You know, I believe you know, like my Jewish friend Jacob, I believe deeply in providence, and that I know these slots are hard to come by, and the Lord gave it to you, and the Lord, because I will tell you as a pastor, there are many, many people out there that need to hear your story. And your story is not one that says everything works out great. No, no, it's not the way this world works, but your story is one of faithfulness, and we desperately need that. So,
Providence was the word that came to mind when I saw the slot. So we'll just end on that. So thank
all
you very
right.
much.
Thank you, Mick. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.